The police told a black mother she was hysterical and that her husband was probably involved when her 6-year-old twins disappeared. They were wrong. For 30 years, this is what was really happening inside their quiet, white neighbor's house, and the truth is worse than you can possibly imagine. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The autumn of 1993 in Lake Forest, Illinois, was a portrait of affluent, manicured tranquility. On Sycamore Lane, where immaculate colonial houses stood like proud sentinels behind carpets of perfect green grass, the Johnson family was an anomaly. Not for any reason of character or community standing. David was a respected financial analyst, Mariah a talented graphic designer, but for the simple, inescapable fact that they were one of the only black families in the neighborhood. They were acutely aware of the quiet, unspoken scrutiny this brought, the constant, low-grade pressure to be perfect, to be unimpeachable, to represent more than just themselves. Their world revolved around their 6-year-old twins, Ethan and Olivia. They were a unit of boundless energy and identical infectious smiles. Ethan was the quiet observer, his mind always working, while Olivia was the bold adventurer, his shadow and his leader. They shared a secret language of twitches and glances and a rhythmic code tap-tap that they would tap on the wall between their bedrooms late at night. So it meant, I'm here, you're not alone. On a bright Tuesday afternoon in October, that world broke. The scene was utterly, terrifyingly mundane, the sprawling parking lot of the local supermarket. Mariah was wrestling with the shopping cart, its wheel stubbornly stuck while trying to load the last of the week's groceries into the back of their station wagon. The twins, giddy with post-school energy, were playing a game of tag around a nearby cart corral, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. "Stay where I can see you," Mariah called out, her voice carrying a familiar maternal warning. "We will," Olivia shouted back, her bright pink jacket a flash of color as she dodged Ethan's outstretched hand. It happened in the space of a breath. Mariah finally wrenched the cart free with a loud metallic clang. She shoved it into the corral, turned back to her car, and looked up. The space where her children had been playing was empty. The laughter was gone. The flash of pink was gone. There was no scream, no sound of a car speeding away, no sign of a struggle. There was only an unnerving, absolute silence that rushed in to fill the void where her children used to be. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "Ethan? Olivia?" she called, her voice tight. She walked quickly toward the spot, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. She looked behind the cart corral, down the aisle of parked cars. Nothing. "Eden! Olivia!" she screamed, her voice now raw with a terror that turned heads. A few shoppers paused, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. Mariah ran, her footsteps echoing on the asphalt, her eyes scanning every car, every shadow. She was a woman coming apart at the seams in the middle of a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The initial search was a frantic, disorganized blur of panicked calls to David at his office, of store managers making garbled announcements over the intercom, of circling police cars whose arrival seemed to make the nightmare horribly officially real. The questions from the first responding officers immediately carried a subtle, unnerving edge. "Are you and your husband having any problems, ma'am?" one of them asked, his eyes scanning her face not with sympathy, but with a cool, detached suspicion. "What? No, my children are missing," she cried, the absurdity of the question a slap in the face. The abduction itself had been a masterpiece of predatory patience and chilling simplicity. Judith Sinclair, the quiet, reclusive librarian who lived just a few houses down from the Johnsons, had been watching them for weeks. She had studied their routines, the predictable rhythm of their happy, successful lives. She saw a family she believed was unsuitable for her perfect neighborhood, and a beautiful little girl she felt an overwhelming, twisted desire to save. She had parked her nondescript gray van directly next to the Johnson station wagon, using its bulk as a visual shield. As the twins played, she had approached them, her face a mask of gentle concern. "Oh, hello there," she'd said, her librarian's voice soft and kind. "I seem to have lost my little puppy. I think he's hiding in my van. Would you be sweet enough to help me look for him?" The twins, taught to be polite, had hesitated for only a second. A puppy was an irresistible lure. They had followed her to the side door of the van. In a single, fluid motion, she had opened the door, bundled them inside, and closed it. All in the few seconds it took for Mariah to wrestle with the shopping cart. There was no struggle, no scream that anyone would notice, just the quiet, final thud of a closing door. The formal police investigation began not as a search for two missing children, but as a quiet, unofficial interrogation of the Johnson family itself. The lead detective, a man named Miller, with tired eyes and a deep-seated belief in his own infallible gut, conducted the interviews. His questions were a masterclass in coded language and racial bias. He sat across from David Johnson in a small, windowless room at the station, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. David, a man whose world had just been obliterated, whose heart was a raw, screaming wound, was treated not as a grieving father but as a person of interest. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, but the adrenaline and terror were a brutal fuel. "You do well for yourself, Mr. Johnson," Miller began, flipping through a thin file, not making eye contact. "Financial analyst, nice house in Lake Forest, expensive car. That can bring a lot of pressure. Sometimes people get into situations. Debts, maybe. Owe the wrong people money."
David stared at the detective, a vein pulsing in his temple. "My children have been kidnapped," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "My 6-year-old babies are gone. And you're asking me about my finances?" "Just trying to get the full picture," Miller said smoothly, finally looking up. His gaze was flat, devoid of empathy. "A man like you, sometimes you make enemies. Sometimes things at home aren't as perfect as they look on the outside. Are you having any marital problems, Mr. Johnson? Any arguments with the missus lately?" The questioning was relentless, insidious. Every aspect of their successful Black life was treated as a potential motive for a crime. Their success was suspicious, their stability was a facade. They were not seen as victims, but as the primary variables in a domestic equation that had gone wrong. Miller leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Look, David, I can call you David, right? Sometimes a man gets overwhelmed. 2 6-year-olds, that's a handful. Maybe you and the wife had a fight. You took the kids to their grandma's to cool off. You can tell me. It'll be easier for everyone." David stood up so fast, his chair screeched back against the concrete floor. "My children are gone," he roared, his composure finally shattering. "Find them." Mariah's testimony, her clear, detailed account of the moments leading up to the disappearance, was treated with a patronizing dismissal. When she insisted that she had taken her eyes off them for no more than 30 seconds, Miller had patted her hand. "Now, Mrs. Johnson, you've been through a terrible trauma. It's easy to get confused about time. Are you sure it wasn't longer? Maybe you were distracted? On the phone, perhaps?" Her certainty was framed as hysteria. Her grief was seen as unreliability. The official police theory, which quickly and quietly leaked to the press, shifted from a terrifying stranger abduction to a possible domestic situation. The narrative was no longer about 2 missing children. It was about the secrets of the Black family who lived on Sycamore Lane. This racist misdirection was a catastrophic failure. It destroyed any chance of a real, time-sensitive investigation. While the police were busy scrutinizing the Johnsons' bank records and interviewing their friends about the state of their marriage, Judith Sinclair was cementing her crime. The critical first 48 hours were wasted. The community, initially so supportive, began to pull away. The whispers started, fueled by the subtle implications in the news reports. The casseroles stopped arriving. A week after the disappearance, Mariah, unable to stand the suffocating silence of her house, forced herself to go to the supermarket for milk. It was a mistake. As she walked down the cereal aisle, a place where Olivia had once begged for Sugar Smacks, she felt the eyes on her. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment. She saw 2 women she knew from the neighborhood PTA. They saw her, their eyes widened, and they quickly turned their carts and hurried down another aisle as if she were contagious. At the checkout, the cashier, who had always been friendly, couldn't meet her gaze, her hands fumbling with the change. The silence in the car on the way home was heavier than any sound. The Johnsons were left not only grieving, but also unjustly scrutinized and isolated, trapped in a nightmare with no allies. The case went cold with a brutal efficiency, with no ransom note, no witnesses, and a police department focused on the wrong people. There were no leads to follow. The official file was thick with interviews with the Johnsons' friends and family, but contained almost no record of a real search for an abductor. The shadow of suspicion, though never officially stated, hung over David and Mariah for years, a final, cruel twist of the knife. 30 years is a lifetime. For Mariah Johnson, it was a sentence served in a prison of hope and despair. The cloud of suspicion over her family eventually faded, replaced by the town's weary pity, but the injustice of that initial investigation had forged her grief into a sharp, unyielding purpose. In 2023, Mariah was a woman in her late 50s, her face a roadmap of her long sorrow, but her eyes held a fire that had never been extinguished. Her home office was the heart of her 30-year war. One wall was a massive corkboard covered with a map of Lake Forest, photos of Ethan and Olivia, age progressed by forensic artists every 5 years, and a web of string and index cards connecting every dead-end lead. She had become a tireless advocate, the founder of a small but fierce nonprofit, The Unheard, dedicated to raising awareness for missing children of color whose cases were often neglected or mismanaged. She was on the phone now, her voice a low, steady anchor for the panicked woman on the other end of the line. A 7-year-old boy named Kevin had vanished from a playground in Gary, Indiana 2 days ago. "Listen to me, Keisha," Mariah said, her pen scratching notes on a legal pad. "I know you're scared, but you cannot let them sideline you. Did they ask you about your husband? About money problems? Good. That's the first thing they do. They will try to make this your fault because it's easier than doing the real work." The woman on the other end sobbed. They said I was hysterical. Mariah closed her eyes, the word a familiar ghost. "Of course they did," she said, her voice hardening with a 30-year-old anger. "That's their word for a mother who is fighting. Now you need to be more than a mother. You need to be a general. Call the local news station yourself. Call the one in Chicago. Send them Kevin's picture. Use the words endangered and missing. Do not let them call him a runaway. You demand a press conference. You make so much noise they can't ignore you. That is the only way they will listen." She spent another hour on the phone, giving Keisha a crash course in a curriculum she had learned through bitter experience, how to organize a search party, how to print her own flyers, how to talk to reporters. She was giving this stranger the roadmap she had never had. When she hung up, the silence of her office settled around her. She was fighting not just for her own children anymore, but for all the children whose faces had been allowed to fade from the public consciousness. Less than a mile away, in Judith Sinclair's unassuming suburban home, Olivia, now known only as Chloe, was having her daily history lesson. Judith, now in her late 70s, sat opposite her at the dining room table, a gentle, loving smile on her face. The world outside the thick curtains of their house did not exist. "The early 20th century was a time of great sickness, my dear," Judith explained, her voice soft and patient. "Influenza, polio, terrible diseases that swept through the cities. People were not as careful as we are. They were dirty. They allowed strangers into their homes. That is why we must stay here where it is clean and safe, where I can protect you." This was the cornerstone of Chloe's reality. The outside world was a terrifying, dangerous place filled with germs and violent, unpredictable people. Judith was her sole protector, her teacher, her friend, her God. She had been meticulously homeschooled from a curriculum Judith designed herself, one that focused on classic literature, art history, and a version of world history that was scrubbed clean of anything Judith deemed unpleasant or unsuitable. There was no mention of Black history, culture, or identity. When Chloe, as a young girl, had once asked why her skin was a different color from Judith's, her mother had concocted a sad, beautiful story about a brave, exotic princess from a faraway land who had entrusted her only daughter to Judith for safekeeping before tragically succumbing to one of the world's many dangers. Chloe had cherished this story. It made her special. Judith kept Chloe's hair straightened and chemically treated, a laborious process they performed every few months in the kitchen. "Your hair is so beautifully thick, my love," Judith would say as she worked the pungent chemicals through her curls, "but it can be unruly. We must tame it, keep it neat and tidy." Every trace of Olivia's heritage was systematically, lovingly erased. For Ethan, time ceased to exist. His world was a tapestry of sensory deprivation, a universe defined by the cold, rough texture of the concrete floor against his skin, the damp, musty smell of his own body, and the constant, low hum of the furnace that was his only companion. He had mapped the house above him through sound. He knew the groan of the pipes when the shower was running. Oh, He knew the faint, muffled footsteps of a single person, a person he did not know, pacing in the room directly above his cell. He knew the rhythm of his imprisonment, the scrape of the metal slot opening, the thud of the plastic bowl on the concrete floor, the terror and relief that came with that sound, and the profound, absolute silence that followed. His mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, had clung to a single fractured memory, a face, a girl who looked like him, a secret language. He had found a small, smooth stone that had been in his pocket on that last day, and with it, he began to tap on the concrete floor. In the crushing, eternal darkness, it was the only thing he could do. Tap, tap, tap. It was a prayer to a sister he could no longer picture. A message sent into a void he prayed was not empty. It was the only piece of his identity he had left. The carefully constructed, monstrous world of Judith Sinclair came crashing down on a cold Tuesday in the winter of 2023. Chloe, now a pale, quiet woman of 36, found Judith on the floor of the living room, her face slack, her body unresponsive. A massive stroke had finally breached the walls of the fortress Judith had built around them. Panicked, her carefully controlled world shattered. Chloe did the one thing she had been taught her entire life to fear. She called for help. The arrival of paramedics was a terrifying, overwhelming intrusion of the dangerous world she had been warned about. They rushed Judith to the hospital, leaving Chloe alone in the house for the first time in her life. The silence was vast, unnerving. It was a physical presence, pressing in on her from all sides. For 30 years, every moment had been filled with Judith's presence, her voice, her rules. Now there was nothing. With her mother incapacitated and the doctors at the hospital asking for insurance cards and medical records she couldn't find, Chloe was forced to do something she had never done before: search Judith's private spaces. She started with the desk in the study, her hands trembling as she touched the forbidden objects of her mother's life. The drawers were filled with old library records, neatly organized bills, and books on art history. Nothing. She moved to the bedroom, her heart pounding with a feeling of profound transgression. She searched the closet, the dressers, the nightstand, still nothing. Her desperation grew. The only place left to look was the one place she had been conditioned since childhood to fear with a primal terror: the locked door in the basement. Her mother had always called it the storage room. It was where she kept the dangerous chemicals from her old librarian job, bookbinding adhesives and solvents that she claimed were highly toxic and could cause terrible burns. As a child, Judith had staged a small accident with a bottle of ammonia to demonstrate the danger, the fumes leaving Chloe coughing and crying, the lesson seared into her memory. That door was a symbol of absolute prohibition, a boundary she had never even considered crossing. The memory of the acrid smell and the burning in her lungs was as vivid now as it was 30 years ago. Never go near that door, Chloe. It will hurt you. But now, a new, more immediate fear overrode the old one. She needed those papers. And a deeper, more terrifying question began to form in her mind. What kind of woman keeps her most important documents in a room filled with poison? The logic of her world was beginning to fray at the edges. The rules didn't make sense anymore. She remembered seeing a small, heavy iron key on the ring with the house keys her mother always kept in a ceramic bowl by the door. She had never known what it was for. Judith had always brushed off her questions about it. With a dawning, sickening sense of dread, she retrieved it. The key felt cold and heavy in her hand, like a piece of a forgotten tomb. Her heart pounding, she descended the basement stairs. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and the low, constant hum of the furnace. She stood before the door, a plain, solid oak door that looked utterly ordinary, yet radiated a palpable sense of menace. For a long moment, she just stared at it, the key clutched in her sweaty palm. Every instinct, every lesson Judith had ever taught her screamed at her to turn around, to go back upstairs, to leave the secrets of the house undisturbed. But the silence of the empty house was louder. She had to know. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. The lock, stiff from decades of disuse, turned with a loud, stiff click that seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. She took a deep breath, pulled the door open, and found not a storage room, but a small, Spartan antechamber. An airlock. In it was a single wooden chair, a small table, and on the opposite wall, a second door. This door was different. It was made of solid steel, thick and gray, with no handle, only a series of heavy deadbolts. At the bottom was a small, sliding metal slot. The air in the small room was stale, tinged with the same faint, bleach-like smell from her childhood. Accident. A cold, unnameable dread washed over her. This was not for storing chemicals. This was for containing something. Chloe stared at the steel door, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. A lifetime of conditioned fear warred with a new, terrifying curiosity. The small room, the airlock, was a place of profound menace. The single wooden chair faced the steel door, its position suggesting long hours of silent observation. On the small table next to it sat a dusty, ancient baby monitor from the early 1990s. Its power cord unplugged, its plastic yellowed with age like an old bone. Beside it was a neat stack of empty plastic bowls, all identical, all stained with a faint grayish residue. This wasn't storage. This was a guard post. This was a feeding station. Her breath hitched. The story of dangerous chemicals was a lie. This room was designed to keep something or someone in. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like ice water in her veins, she reached out and touched the heavy deadbolts on the steel door. They were stiff from disuse, but they were not locked from the outside. One by one, she began to slide them open, each one retracting with a loud metallic thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house and her own reality. Thud. Thud, thud. With the last bolt open, she pulled the heavy door toward her. It moved with a groan of protest, scraping against the concrete floor. The smell hit her first, a wave of horrific, indescribable foulness that made her gag and stumble backward. It was the smell of sickness, of waste, of a life lived in utter filth and darkness. It was the smell of something that had been left to rot while still alive. And then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound from the pitch-black darkness beyond the door. It wasn't a voice. It was a scraping, a tapping, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Tap, tap, tap. Her hand shaking, she pulled out the smartphone the paramedics had insisted she take, a piece of alien technology she barely knew how to use. She fumbled with it until she found the flashlight function. A bright, clean beam of light cut through 30 years of darkness. The beam illuminated a scene from the deepest circle of hell. The room was a small, bare concrete box. In the corner, chained to a thick iron ring in the wall by a rusted chain around his ankle, was a man. He was pale, his skin almost translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. His hair was a long, filthy, matted curtain that hid his face. He was curled in a fetal position, his body covered in sores. He recoiled from the light, letting out a dry, guttural, hissing sound like an animal disturbed in its lair, and scrambled to the furthest corner of the box. Chloe screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure, uncomprehending terror. She dropped the phone, and the light went out, plunging the scene back into darkness. She scrambled back, slamming the heavy steel door shut, the deadbolts sliding home with a series of final, echoing thuds. She ran up the stairs, out of the house and into the cold winter air, her mind completely shattered. When the police summoned by her frantic, incoherent 911 call arrived, they found her huddled on the front lawn, rocking back and forth, unable to speak. They followed her terrified gestures down into the basement. Detective Harding, a modern, sharp investigator, was the first one through the door after his officers breached it. He had been a cop for 20 years and thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. The stench hit him like a physical blow, but he pushed past it, his professional training taking over. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the chained figure. "Oh my God," he breathed, his voice a stunned whisper. He saw the filth, the chain, the pale, emaciated form of a human being who had been erased from the world. He saw the walls covered in a complex series of vertical scratches, a primitive calendar system. He did a quick, horrified calculation. There were over 10,000 marks, 30 years of food deliveries. In one corner, his light caught a small, smooth stone, its surface worn down from decades of use. And then Harding saw it. The man on the floor, now being carefully attended to by medics who were working with a grim, focused urgency, was subconsciously tapping his fingers against the concrete. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm. A message. It was the only piece of his identity he had managed to keep alive in the suffocating darkness. It was the ghost of a boy named Ethan. Harding turned away, his stomach churning, and radioed for the full weight of the county's forensic and medical services. This wasn't just a crime scene. This was a desecration. The phone call was the hardest Detective Harding had ever had to make. He sat in his car outside the house on Sycamore Lane, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles painting the quiet, affluent street in strokes of chaos and horror. He held the Johnson family's file in his hand, the faded 1993 contact number staring up at him. For 30 years, this number had been a link to a cold, dead case. Now he had to use it to deliver a miracle that was also a monstrosity. He took a deep breath and dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice, wary and professional, answered. Mariah Johnson. Mrs. Johnson, Harding began, his own voice sounding strange and distant to his ears. My name is Detective Harding with the Lake Forest Police Department. I'm calling about a case from 1993, the disappearance of your children, Ethan and Olivia. There was a sharp, brittle silence on the other end. When Mariah spoke again, her voice was devoid of all warmth, replaced by the cold, hard armor she had built over 3 decades. What about it, Detective? Has someone come forward with another false memory? Have you found another person of interest you'd like to harass my husband about? Harding flinched. He had read the old file. He knew exactly why she sounded like that. No, ma'am, nothing like that. Mrs. Johnson, I need you to listen to me very carefully. We are currently at a residence on Sycamore Lane, the home of a Ms. Judith Sinclair, a librarian, Mariah whispered, the name a ghost from a past she had replayed 1,000,000 times. She lived 4 doors down. The police cleared her. I know, ma'am, Harding said gently, but there's been a medical emergency. Miss Sinclair is incapacitated. We gained entry to the house. Mrs. Johnson's. We found someone in the basement. He paused, struggling for the right words, knowing there were none. We found a young man, and we found a young woman. Ma'am, we have reason to believe they are your children. The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched for 5 seconds, 10, an eternity. Harding could hear nothing but the faint sound of his own breathing. He thought the line had gone dead. Are they alive? Mariah finally whispered, the words so fragile they sounded like breaking glass. The armor was gone. All that was left was a mother. Yes, ma'am, Harding said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't suppress. They are alive. Sound came through the phone then, a raw, guttural sob of 30 years of pain and hope and terror being released in a single, explosive moment. It was the sound of a world breaking all over again, but this time with a terrifying, impossible ray of light shining through the cracks. We need you and your husband to come to the station, ma'am, Harding said softly. We'll explain everything. They're receiving medical care. They're safe now. But as he said the words safe, looking at the house of horrors behind him, he knew it was the biggest lie he had ever told. The truth, when it finally came, was a brutal, multifaceted cataclysm. Judith Sinclair lay unresponsive in a hospital bed, her mind a locked room of its own, her secrets and motives trapped forever beyond the reach of earthly justice. But the science was undeniable. DNA tests confirmed the impossible. The pale, traumatized man from the basement was Ethan Johnson, and the terrified young woman known as Chloe Sinclair was his identical twin sister, Olivia. For Mariah and David Johnson, the news was not a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a disorienting, heartbreaking miracle. They got their children back, but they were strangers, ghosts, returned from a 30-year war. The first meeting with Olivia was a carefully orchestrated event at the medical facility, held in a room painted in calming, neutral colors. A kind-faced therapist named Dr. Anya Sharma had briefed them beforehand. Remember, she had said, her voice gentle but firm, the woman you are about to meet is not the 6-year-old you lost. Her name is Chloe. The woman who raised her was her entire world. You are strangers to her. You are, in a very real sense, a threat to the only reality she has ever known. We have to go slowly. Mariah and David sat on one side of a small table, their hands clenched together, their hearts pounding with a 30-year-old hope and a brand new terror. Dr. Sharma gently led Olivia into the room. She was a ghost in her own right, pale and thin, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to consume her. She looked at Mariah and David, these two strangers who claimed to be her parents, and she physically recoiled, shrinking back toward the therapist as if seeking shelter from a storm. "Olivia," Mariah whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. "My baby." The name meant nothing to the young woman. She only knew Chloe. She stared at Mariah's face, at her brown skin, at the kindness in her eyes, and it was like looking at something from another planet. It was a contradiction to the world Judith had built, and it terrified her. She clutched the sleeve of Dr. Sharma's sweater. "It's all right, Chloe," the therapist said softly. "These are the people I told you about. This is Mariah and David. They just want to talk." I don't understand, Olivia whispered, her voice a reedy, unused thing. "Where is my mother? Is she okay?" Mariah's heart broke. "We are your parents, honey," she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. That woman took you from us." Olivia shook her head violently, her eyes filling with tears of fear and confusion, not recognition. No, you're lying. My mother protected me. She kept me safe. The world is dangerous. You're the danger." She wouldn't speak further. She wouldn't make eye contact. She just sat, trembling, a stranger with her daughter's face. Mariah saw the ghost of the 6-year-old she had lost, but the woman before her was a stranger, her own child, held captive by a lie so complete it had become her only truth. This was not a reunion. It was an introduction across a chasm of stolen time. The briefings on Ethan's condition were even more brutal. They sat in a sterile conference room with a kind but brutally honest neurologist named Dr. Ayers Thorne. He didn't soften the blow. "What you have to understand," the doctor said, his voice calm and steady as he looked at the charts in front of him, "is that Ethan's brain has been fundamentally rewired by 30 years of profound sensory deprivation. It's a phenomenon we sometimes see in extreme cases of institutionalization, but this is unprecedented." "What does that mean?" David asked, his voice hoarse. Can he get better?" Dr. Thorne met his gaze. "His optic nerves have atrophied from the lack of light. The damage is severe. We believe he is, for all practical purposes, permanently and almost completely blind. His muscles have wasted away to the point where he cannot support his own weight. That can be addressed with intensive, painful physical therapy, but the deepest damage is psychological." Mariah leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "His mind. What's wrong with his mind, doctor?" "His brain doesn't know how to process the world," Dr. Thorne explained. "For 30 years, his only significant sensory inputs were the cold floor, the taste of his food, and the sound of his own body. Now, everything is an assault: the feel of a blanket, the sound of a voice, the light under a door. It's a painful, terrifying overload. We have to reintroduce the world to him, one sensation at a time, and we have no idea how much he will be able to tolerate or ever truly comprehend. In a very real sense, the world you and I live in is a foreign country to him, and he has no passport." The final, haunting scene of their shattered family took place weeks later in a quiet therapy room at the facility. Ethan sat on one side of the room, rocking, always rocking. Olivia sat on the other, withdrawn and silent, a stranger in her own skin. Mariah and David watched, their hearts breaking with a grief that was somehow sharper and more complex than the one they had carried for 30 years. This was not a reunion. This was the wreckage. This was the aftermath of a war they hadn't even known was being fought. Then, in the quiet of the room, Ethan's hand resting on his leg began to move. His fingers, thin and pale, started to tap out a faint, almost imperceptible rhythm against his thigh. Tap, tap, tap. And across the room, Olivia froze, her head tilted, a flicker of something ancient and deeply buried in her eyes. Her own hand, resting on the arm of her chair, began to twitch. And then, without conscious thought, her fingers began to mirror the rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Mariah held her breath, tears streaming down her face. She looked at these two broken strangers who were her children, and for the first time, she saw not the separate tragedies, but the single shared one. It was a ghost of a connection, a language of the dark, the only one they still shared across an ocean of stolen time. It wasn't the conversation of a mother and her children. It was the first faint, heartbreaking echo of a language she would have to learn to speak, a signal from a foreign country she would spend the rest of her life trying to reach. It wasn't a reunion. It was a beginning.